Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Discover Reading podcast. On today's episode, we welcome Dr. David Dobrasic. David is an old colleague of mine and a current one of Phil's. I should say that David is a very gifted conversationalist and an expert in the field of education, a topic which, of course, affects each and every one of us. Our conversation covers many different elements, but the complexity of analysing the UK's education system, the dangers of focusing solely upon outcomes, generations struggle with schooling, the intertwining relationship between education and society are the clear standout themes. All right, guys, enjoy the episode. So welcome to the podcast, David. If you could just please introduce yourself, let us know what your journey through professional life has been and what you're currently working on now.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So my name is David Dobrasic, and I'm currently a lecturer in education at the University of Reading. In terms of my journey to here, it's a really interesting one. I've had a, perhaps you could say, slightly unconventional journey to being a lecturer within education. So I actually started off doing engineering, interestingly enough, sports engineering. And I think for me, I was always fascinated by how things worked, why things worked the way they did. So engineering mechanically was initially of interest to me. But actually, as time went on, I think I became more interested in the social world, how people work, how groups work, how society works. And so I suppose that's sort of the link, if you like, that brings those two together. So yeah, having sort of finished a degree in engineering, I actually went into youth work, working with young people, and it's really there that I became aware of things like inequalities, disadvantage, how people experience different things in life, and how that led to different outcomes and different journeys. So that was the starting point. I've subsequently gone on to complete a master's and more recently a PhD in the sociology of education. And so that's kind of led me to now teaching on the education studies program at the University of Reading, which is an interesting program, actually. Quite often people would assume that education is all about being a teacher or teaching, working in schools, colleges, for example. But actually, the education studies program I teach on is much broader than that. It looks at sociological aspects, the links between health and education, for example, how education can happen in the charity sector, or museum education, for example, where people are learning about historical artifacts. So really, it's kind of a broad and varied look at education in all its guises and how it applies in really all walks of life. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and how I've got to where I am today.
And I think it's always good when people have a bit more of a varied background, because then they bring a bit of variety to their teaching as well. But yeah, me and Chris were particularly interested in your research that you did for your PhD, and just wanted if you could just tell us a bit more about that, and if there are any standout lessons that you learned from your research.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a difficult thing to be asked about a PhD. I'm sure other people will realise, it's a big project, 100,000 words. You invest a good few years of your life in it, and then to try and condense it down into snapshots is something that's challenging. So if I try and just start off kind of the basic level, the fundamental focus of my research is on school to work transitions through the lens of education. So most people will make that journey at some stage. You leave school at whatever age it is, whether you leave school at 16, whether you carry on until 18, go to university, and then eventually make that transition into the world of work. And it's really the role that education plays in that, or more specifically, the role that education plays in affecting the transitions people make. So for example, some people might go into quite high level professional jobs, other people might go into more vocational, practical jobs, and actually how young people's experiences of education affect the way they see themselves, the way they see themselves as learners, the way they see their aspirations and what's possible for them. So I think it's a really interesting and complex field, and there's so much research done within the sociology of education about the reasons why education can maintain inequalities, but also disrupt them. So, for example, in the UK and in England in particular, we tend to see this competitive cycle of young people from working class backgrounds tending not to get so much out of education. They don't tend to achieve as well. They don't tend to stay in education for as long, and that inevitably leads to lower level jobs when they're older, lower paid jobs, and it becomes a bit of a cycle, this kind of cycle of inequality. So in terms of a standout lesson, that's really the main one. It's a huge topic, this idea of reproduction, they call it, how education is reproductive, and how actually generation upon generation it sort of reproduces the inequalities that we see in society. I mentioned class, but also in terms of gender. There's lots of research going back to the 1970s around how girls, particularly working class girls, tend to not stay in education as long. They have different aspirations. They might tend to choose subjects which are more stereotypically associated with females, so caring jobs, as opposed to aspiring to be a CEO or wanting to be a lawyer, for example. I think the land is changing, which is good, but there are certainly elements of that still persisting. And also a big topic recently has been in terms of ethnicity as well, across the school ages, and particularly at university at the moment. Lots of conversation about why students from certain ethnic backgrounds don't achieve as well as their white counterparts, for example. So I think for me, it's really the inequalities and what education can do to try and break those inequalities, but also really important to understand the role education plays in maintaining them as well, because we have to understand it before we can actually try and tackle it and do something about it.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting phrase which you just used, the way if you want education can maintain these inequalities, then also you're referencing the fact that quite often these outcomes can seem generational. So for the records, I was a teacher, not a very good teacher, but during that time of teaching, it was very insightful. I was working quite a challenging school in Southampton. And I guess you'd say it was quite a white working class community, and it was striking the relationship which some kids would have with their teachers and would have with their school would be quite dependent upon their parents. And so you saw with some families, again, working class families, but the parents would work with the teachers quite effectively to help their kids overcome the barriers. But then there'll be some families, and they'll be well known within the school, well known within the community for it always being the same sort of sad story. The kids come forward, they struggle, they have issues in class, and then it was exactly the same for their parents before. So I'd be curious to know, how well or effectively do you think we're actually breaking that kind of cycle as a country? Because I guess just to complicate it further, one thing that also struck me when I was doing quite a lot of analysis work was it also appeared to be a little bit regional. So I feel like in places such as London, it's being done quite effectively, and there's lots of standout examples of that. But Southampton, and also I know the Isle of Wight was another big one. Some colleagues who are working there have felt like in those parts, at points they were almost forgotten, and that cycle was being challenged and broken less effectively.
Yeah, really interesting points there, Chris. I think you've highlighted a number of complexities behind this issue, and I'll come on to your points about regionality as well. But just kind of to bring some theory to it, in one way, there's research, like I say, that goes back to the kind of 60s and 70s, and there's a famous piece of writing by Paul Willis. He talks about the working class lads. And what he found back then, and I think this still rings true today, is that there was a resistance to education. There was kind of an anti-education stance, but actually for fairly good reason. So these young lads that he worked with, to use his term, were aware, because of their social class, their background, that education wouldn't really deliver for them in terms of the labour market, in terms of social mobility. And so from their point of view, what was the point of trying in school? Because they knew that actually, to a certain extent, their fate was already set, or their path was certainly limited compared to some of their peers. And it's one of those things where if you try really hard at something and you fail, it's harder to swallow than if you don't really try at all.
Mhm.
So there was almost this position where they would say, well, I'm not really going to put the effort in because actually I'm not going to do very well anyway, so I'm going to try hard and fail. And so I think there's an element of that, and it's so embedded within our kind of structural class system that actually breaking those anti-education dispositions, breaking that resistance, breaking a sense that education isn't necessarily for people from certain backgrounds is a really, really challenging one. To kind of link it to your points about the regional aspect to it, you know, certainly in terms of higher education and participation at university, we definitely see a regional trends. And again, I think it comes back to opportunity. You know, if you live in quite a rural area, perhaps the labour market isn't there, the opportunities aren't there, so you don't necessarily see the connection between education and those opportunities. Whereas in London, you know, because of the economic situation, it's, you know, much more well off. There's much more going on there. Perhaps there is a greater opportunity for young people to, you know, become socially mobile and break free from some of the structural factors, class, ethnicity, gender, that have historically limited people's opportunities. So yes, absolutely, it is a challenge. Are we doing enough? This is a huge question, and I think it's really difficult for government to try and grapple with something which is, as we've identified already, so complex. To take it off on a bit of a tangent, I think fundamentally there's lots of research which links this back to capitalism and a capitalist society, and that the reality is that breeds a scenario where we inevitably have winners and losers. There are only so many positions in society for people to become working middle-class professionals. It's a competitive environment, and so actually it's all very well doing well in school, it's all very well doing well at university, but if you're competing for places, then people who come from more privileged backgrounds tend to have other advantages, whether that's their social networks or whether it's the fact that they have a parent who already works in a professional context who can guide them through that process a little bit. You know, I think really to tackle these issues, you have to go way beyond education itself and look more fundamentally at the way our labour market is structured, the way our society reinforces class divides, etc. So to expect schools to do that alone is really quite a big ask, I would say.
Definitely. I feel like we could go down quite a significant tangent there. I remember we used to have these long conversations. It is interesting in terms of like everything is dependent upon the school. So the school has to do everything, but the school is a reflection of the labour market. Well, just if you want to deepen the discussion a little bit, what are the kinds of things in education which you think we actually do quite well as a country, and what are the things where you think we can improve upon? Because I guess instinctively when I was teaching, I did notice that if you had a working class kid, they were fairly academically minded, they were going to do decently at GCSEs and then go on and be the 5% of the people who go on to university. That was quite good for them. But the struggle came with the other 50%, the ones who would struggle and wouldn't do so well at GCSE, and having everyone through that same system. I guess maybe that'd be the initial point, just to kick it off. It works well for some, but it's not going to work out for others just because different kinds of learners and they're all ultimately progressing the same sort of system.
Absolutely. I suppose just to start off on the points about what we do well, I would just say that as a researcher, as an academic, you tend to be critical. That's the stance that you take. You know, you will get research that talks about things that go well, but it's not perhaps natural for academic and research to talk in those terms. But there probably are a couple of things that could be positives, but I suppose it depends on the way you look at them, could also be seen as negative. So I think if you just look very broadly at global education as a whole, you know, we do have a fairly good performing education system. You know, we are a developed country, so you would sort of expect that, and we don't necessarily compare that well compared to other OECD you know, advanced developed countries. But actually in the context of wider global education, the fact that everyone has free access to education up to the age of 18 is obviously a positive. So from that point of view, you could argue that there are opportunities for people to access and utilize the benefits of education. How achievable that is, it comes back to some of the things we've discussed previously. But actually, coming back to something we were kind of talking about a bit earlier in my PhD research, one of the starting points was looking at where the UK education system, or perhaps more specifically the English education system, came from. What were the principles that underpinned it? And what's the historical nature of its development? And actually, you don't have to go back that long in history to find a point where it wasn't free for everyone. It was kind of the elite, if you like, that were able to access it. And the society kind of decided that, well, actually, society would be a nicer place if everyone is educated. It teaches values and virtues and how to be a good citizen, for example. So perhaps some slightly more philanthropic, altruistic views on why education came about in the first place, which is maintained to a certain extent today. There are teaching around citizenship. Our curriculum is obviously has values embedded within it. So actually, there are some kind of positives there. If we didn't have a good quality free access education system, perhaps our society could be not as nice a place as it is, for example. What are the things we could improve upon? I suppose, from my point of view, coming back to some earlier conversations about inequalities, perhaps one of the tendencies of an education system, not just ours, but perhaps even more so the English education system, is to focus very heavily on outcomes. So the grades that the students achieve, it's very much success is deemed based on the grades you get, assessments and things like that. Whereas actually, there's an alternative argument to say that education should really be about developing the person, developing good dispositions. And that's something that I talk about quite extensively in my own research, the idea that perhaps the most important thing is for young people to develop a good attachment with learning. The idea that you see yourself as a learner, someone who can learn, who finds it a positive experience and wants to continue learning, not just at school, but throughout life. People may have heard the phrase lifelong learning. It's certainly gained traction over recent years, certainly in the last decade. And the idea that it's no longer good enough to just finish education and then stop learning, whether it's professional development within the workplace or whether it's further study, further qualifications, to kind of react to changing labour markets, to be able to develop your professional profile and to get new jobs and develop your career. It's important to always stay in that learning mode. So actually, from my point of view, to really garner that in people and in our population, perhaps there should be a shift away from a focus on grades, which is, I would argue, a bit arbitrary. What are we really measuring by getting people to just do exams and giving them a grade, and perhaps shifting more to a focus on giving people positive learning experiences, a positive relationship with educational establishments such as schools, for example. And we might also see that breaks down some of the challenges we have around inequalities. And there's lots of research about how certain kind of ethnic and social groups in particular feel as though they don't fit into higher education. Whereas actually, if we can kind of break down some of the perhaps slightly old school perceptions around education, that might affect those things positively.
And it sounds like your research makes some really interesting recommendations and clear points of how things could be improved. I was thinking as well, when you were mentioning about kind of the UK, and we often hear it being compared to other developed countries, and it is kind of a narrative almost of like the UK is the worst in Europe or whatever, lots of things, and education seems to be one of the things that pops up quite frequently. I was wondering, you mentioned before how it's all a complicated area. How complicated is it in terms of like, is there kind of a list of best practice that people look at and it's agreed upon in terms of education research, or is it just ongoing debates and it really is kind of so difficult to pin down what good looks like or what would actually work?
Yeah, really interesting question. And as with the rest of the questions so far, there's probably not a straightforward answer I can give, unfortunately. I think the problem with it is that education has become so ideological, and it's become so intertwined with other aspects of life and politics. So you can't really separate education from the economy, particularly in developed countries. You know, it's so linked to preparing people for the labour market, developing particular skills. You know, there's been loads of research and talk about this idea of a knowledge economy, and that actually the reason we need so many young people to go to higher education is because we want to develop an economy and a labour market based on knowledge, knowing stuff, rather than practical skills or resources. The accumulated knowledge that we have as a population is what we're selling, if you like, globally. So from that very broad perspective, like I say, I think education in terms of best practice is a little bit at the mercy of what we need economically. And to go back to my initial point about ideology, you could wander into philosophy here as well around actually what is the purpose of education? Is it to train the brightest minds? And therefore, do you focus education and pitch it high to stretch the brightest? Obviously, in contested term, I don't believe in this kind of an innate idea of ability, but if you look at a system of grades, for example, are you working for the people who are high achievers, or actually should an education system really be about, like I say, developing a well-rounded population, a well-rounded society? Should it be about ensuring that everyone gets a good education and nobody gets left behind, even if that means that you don't stretch some of the kind of higher achieving students? And these are the sort of tensions that policymakers and practitioners, educators will grapple with on a daily basis. And so actually, I think whether there is a list of best practices very much comes down to your ideological position on this, because someone who believed that actually we should be inspiring the next generation of great thinkers might argue that we need a challenging curriculum, really challenging pedagogy, and actually doesn't matter if certain students get left behind. But then others might argue that, well, that will only feed into inequalities and disenfranchisement with education and society more generally. So on a very practitioner-based implementation level, there probably is something around, so for example, there's some research which says that learners who are empowered to set their own targets tend to achieve more highly and engage more positively in learning. So if you're a teacher and you're being too directive, too didactic, saying, actually, this is what you need to do, I think that this is your aim and your aspiration, you end up creating passive learners, passive students. They're just floating along, being guided. Whereas what you really want is, as a teacher, perhaps who turns around and says, well, what do you want to achieve? What do you want to learn? What do you want to get out of this? To kind of empower the young people and the students to take a bit of ownership of their learning. Obviously, I'm talking in very broad terms here. Anyone who is a teacher, who has been a teacher, will say that the reality is much more challenging, and there are very many competing demands around the practical dimensions of assessing students' work, creating lesson plans, and perhaps there isn't the time and space to think about these more conceptual issues as a teacher. Perhaps it's become too led by numbers, processes, rather than actually what is it to be a teacher. And just to take it off on a final tangent before we come back to some more questions, there was some really interesting research which I came across during my PhD that spoke about the changing nature of teaching, and it spoke about how in previous decades, going back to the 70s, 80s, teaching was really seen as a vocation. People became teachers because they wanted to be in the classroom. They wanted to teach students. It was quite often about preparing the next generation of critical thinkers, for example. Whereas the argument now is that it's become a much more professional focused job where it's about career development. People don't want to be in the classroom for their whole career. You don't want to be 16 in the classroom. You want to become a senior leader, and actually the ambition is to get out of the classroom not as quickly as you can, but it's a bad thing if you're still in the classroom age 60 basically, whereas 30 years ago it was seen as that's the done thing. You hone your skill, your vocation over a number of years so you can become the best at your job basically.
I think there was several insightful points which you just made, but just to hone in on a few more of them a bit more, I was interested when you were speaking about ideology and political ideology, because that's one thing you could definitely feel quite a lot in teaching. And also I'd say if you have a system whereby all the kids in your classroom are going through the same sort of exams, then that ideology really is felt. It's not like it can be broken down in any sort of way. And then you also mentioned outcomes, and that is one thing where I did find it quite dispiriting as a teacher. And some schools manage this part quite well, others do find it a bit more challenging, which is if you've got this huge focus upon GCSE outcomes and the school's success as a good school being completely focused upon those GCSE outcomes. And if those outcomes are purely dependent upon what is quite academic set of exams with a heavy focus upon math, science and English, it puts enormous pressure on those schools and those teachers. And as well, if all the progress is then tracked from primary up until secondary, it becomes this a bit more of a commercial and professional job, if you want, and teachers themselves are also then judged purely on outcome, whereas before it felt like it was a little bit more liberating as a teacher. You'd have a bit more scope, and actually makes it quite difficult for young teachers because it is harder to be yourself. You have to go and get kids through their set of exams. You have to have certain standards. You have to do X, you have to do Y, Z. It seems like it's not necessarily a bad thing to professionalize the teaching sector, but I feel like some of the best and some of the most memorable teachers you'll have in your life are those who are a little bit more off the wall, who don't always follow the exact process and formula. And it seems like it's a bad outcome, ironically, to have if you try and make the education system overly dependent upon these outcomes. And as well, it puts massive pressure on the schools and teachers.
Yeah, exactly that. I think teachers are expected to do so much now, and like you say, it's a really difficult and tension sort of position to just kind of consider, really, because on one hand, there does need to be some accountability. You can't just let teachers do whatever they want in the class. It can't, schools, I don't think can be left completely unchecked, because I'm sure pre Ofsted, pre some of the measures that have been brought in, there probably were examples of bad practice or schools that were failing, and therefore young people that were being failed that were not picked up on. So actually, there probably are some benefits to a system of monitoring. But more widely, I think, like you picked up on there, Chris, and that we've spoken about in terms of GCSE grades, the pressures that are put on teachers, it all for me comes back to a sort of contemporary culture of performance and standards. These are words you hear very commonly within sort of political language, just generally within policy. This goes back actually before this sort of Conservative government. New Labour were quite big on it as well, spoke about standards in education, and so they've sort of got something to answer for as well in terms of the situation that we have now. But I suppose the problem is when your focus is on performance, like we said, actually your focus goes away from what you're doing day to day, the actual process of education, the actual delivery of pedagogy in the classroom, to essentially becoming a bit more of a trainer where you know that you have some content to work through. That there are outcomes to achieve, and it doesn't give you that flexibility to, like you say, Chris, perhaps do something a little bit alternative. I mean, you can even look at the curriculum itself. We don't have a national curriculum in the same way that we used to, but it's sort of dictated to a certain extent by what comes up in the exam papers, which you've identified there are still kind of universal. And there's been lots of debate recently. This is related, but a bit of a tangent around, the lack of exams or exams being cancelled during the pandemic, and teacher assessed grades and how it's led to a massive inflation in the grades that students have achieved. But understandably, if you know that the school next door to you are giving students higher grades, then why wouldn't you? Because otherwise you're just disadvantaging your students. But just to try and bring it back, I think I was at a conference a few years ago, and I can't remember his exact job title, but he works for Ofsted in the research department and sets the agenda for what Ofsted inspections will look at. And he spoke a few years ago about a move towards quality. He kind of recognised that actually there'd been too much focus on performance data, and people had moved away a little bit from thinking about what quality teaching and learning looks like. And so they tried to create a framework for Ofsted inspections that considered more than just grades, that actually paid more attention to good quality teaching in the classroom, good quality lesson planning, good quality learning experiences and activities for the students. But one point he made, which I think really stood out for me, is that Ofsted put this advice out, and what schools tend to do is straight away try and work out what Ofsted are looking for, almost as though it's like a formula or a test of some sort that they have to pass, and then everyone follows what they think is the correct formula to try and pass the Ofsted inspection. And just that phrase itself, the idea of passing the inspection, probably tells you a lot about what you need to know of how it's perceived within schools. It isn't really a matter of pass or fail. It's really about actually understanding how the school operates, what the leadership's like, how the teaching is delivered. But when you look at something in terms of pass or fail, which is perhaps symbolic of the exam assessment culture that we live in, even teachers themselves are thinking in those terms about their own practice. It kind of narrows your thinking, I would say. It kind of limits what you can see as the possibilities of how you can deliver your teaching and what you can be as a practitioner. Perhaps we do need a little bit of a reset in terms of how we conceive education and what we understand by concepts such as performance and standards and quality, and give people a bit more freedom to take risks, I suppose, in a positive way, to actually think about novel ways or innovative ways of delivering learning that benefit their students most. And just to kind of finish up on that point, I think it really brings it back to what you were saying earlier, Chris, when you were comparing schools. Every school will have its own student demographic, its own specific geographical location, with its own challenges. And so actually, it isn't a case of one size fits all. There isn't a universal answer to how schools should operate or how teaching should be done. You do have to be receptive and responsive to your specific context. And perhaps a classroomized approach and a universal approach to assessment of what's a good standard of education is part of the problem in not allowing schools to be more responsive to the local context.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think this links in quite well with our next question about performance and what good educational outcomes look like. And you've already touched on this quite a bit, sort of saying, are exams sort of the best way of getting a good educational outcome? And I remember times like doing exams, and this is a familiar story with a lot of people, where you just cram for the exam, and then as soon as it's done, like the next day, you've already forgotten everything you've been revising for it. And that does seem a bit bizarre in terms of education for life. It's like, did I actually get anything from doing that, or did I just get a good grade? So yeah, I wonder if you could say just a bit more about, is it your opinion that perhaps examinations don't have a place in education, and there's something we could replace them with that would be a lot better?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and there's a consultation going on at the moment about T levels, and this is directly related, but it started a bit of a wider debate on post-16 education more generally, and actually whether final exams at the end of year 13 or whatever it is the best way forward. You think traditionally vocational learning in terms of BTEC, for example, as an alternative to A levels, and a traditionally academic system, focus more on portfolios and coursework, ongoing assessment throughout the period of learning, links to different modes internationally. So there's certain countries who actually have either done this or are contemplating getting rid of exams at 16. What exams really do is, like you said, train you to prepare for an exam, but they also foster that idea of competition. So I don't profess to be a massive expert on comparative education or international education, but I do know that there was some interesting work going on in Singapore recently, where their education system is relatively new compared to it's relatively in its infancy compared to the UK. And at first they saw very low levels of inequality being borne out through the education system. But over time, what they saw was parents becoming attuned to exams and recognizing that they wanted their children to do better than others. And so the more privileged parents were able to find ways to give their children an advantage, whether that's through tuition or they had more capacity to give them support at home, whatever it was. They actually saw that it led to both parental but societal approaches to trying to give your kid a competitive edge, basically. And so in order to overcome that, because it was against the principles of what they wanted their education system to achieve, they considered scrapping exams at 16 to take away that element of competition and thinking about actually my educational success is defined by the grade I get in an exam. And so by doing that, they've tried to create a situation and system where young people are responding to feedback. So they'll still be assessed, they'll still get feedback, but rather than putting a number on something or a grade, right, you're a B grade student, you've got a 75 in this assignment, for example, the focus more becomes about the feedback and the quality of what you're doing. And I certainly know this, having obviously been a student myself and receiving grades on exams or coursework. The first thing you look at is the mark that you've got. And then it's questionable whether you actually look in detail at the feedback you get. There's so much research into the importance of good quality feedback. So in terms of an alternative system and what a good educational outcome would look like, there is an argument for more in-class, I don't want to use the word assessment, but actually participation in learning in the classroom. If teachers can find a way to give feedback on that, and actually what you're rewarded on and what you're recognised for as a learner isn't how well you do in an exam or a piece of coursework even, but how well you engage in class and how well you demonstrate your learning through interaction in the classroom. Because if you think about it, fundamentally, once you've left education, this doesn't ring true across all sectors, but when you're in the labour market, it's quite rare that you're assessed in the same way that you would be at school. So actually, to do a good job in most walks of life isn't necessarily graded. So I suppose it's a little bit at odds with then what you're expected to do once you've left education. So I think it really comes back to what I was saying earlier around you want young people to leave education feeling as though they enjoy learning, they want to continue learning, they have a sense of how to self-regulate and how to seek out learning opportunities in the future. And hopefully what you would see as a result of that is people becoming more engaged as citizens generally, trying to become socially mobile through other means, not just through education itself. And although that's a big aspiration and a big dream, hopefully that's something which could benefit society just more generally.
I think one other element which I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, because you mentioned the way society works, the labour market works, and the way that interplays with education. One thing which we're not good at doing with our school and our education system is say, currently, because it's based upon grades, if a kid leaves at 16, they get poor GCSE, seen as a failure. But if that kid then goes off to be a really successful plumber, surely that you should see that the other way. And maybe if you can move the grades, you can give what I'd call respect to other industries, because again, this taps into the idea of the labour market. But one of the things I do bemoan when I look at Parliament is, for me, there's not really what I'd call working class representation in the sense that you don't get too many brickies going on into Parliament, and maybe that's something which you could try and identify and fix. It shouldn't necessarily be seen as a failure if a kid leaves school to go on and be a brickie and plumber, whereas at the moment a little bit is viewed in that way purely because they don't get good GCSEs, for example. Yeah,
it's a really interesting point, and it does come back to wider inequalities, and like you've identified there, the labour market. We have one of the most unequal societies and labour markets in the world. You see other countries where, for example, pay is a lot more even. So to give you use an example of a bricklayer there, now, I imagine in all countries and all societies, they wouldn't be paid as well as a top surgeon, for example. But if the pay gap was smaller, then automatically it gives more value to those jobs. And actually, like you say, perhaps it's recognised more as a skill, as a valuable skill, rather than something which is associated with, like you say, people who have failed in education. And obviously in this country, traditionally, it's like a sort of working class type job. And I think that's probably a fundamental part of it. The class divide is so much deeper than just money in this country. It's really to do with culture as well, and actually how people perceive the differences between middle class and working class and upper class, and however you want to structure it. Maybe just more generally as a society, those things are so embedded. Because if you think about, I'm not a historian, Chris, maybe this is more in your wheelhouse, but you think about our development as a country where we kind of had very rich landowners and aristocracy, and you're thinking about the way our democracy is developed as well, and you look at Parliament now and the very traditional way we operate. It doesn't really feel very accessible to a wide audience, and I would argue that that's by design, that's through intention. If you think about it, people who are more privileged, what's the motivation for you to allow other people into your privileged circle? Because actually, coming back to what I was saying earlier about there are only so many spaces in society at different levels, in order for someone to become socially mobile, you either have to grow a particular proportion of society, middle class, whatever, or people have to become downwardly socially mobile to make space for somebody to become upwardly socially mobile. So if you're a part of the privileged group, it's not really in your interests for people to break into that, because it creates more competition for places within that level of society. And I don't really know what you can do about that. I don't know if many people do have the answer, really. I think what you tend to see, and I would argue this is the case with education, is that really when you go to university and you get a degree or you do a master's or whatever your highest qualification is, what we're really talking about is a very small proportion of the social hierarchy are competing for places. Actually, there's elements of the social hierarchy that most people can't even dream of accessing. Old money, super wealthy, and then you can talk about real poverty and real deprivation. It's really that competition in the middle. So it's all just a microcosm, really. The bigger picture is, this comes back to more Labour policies about redistribution, and actually how can we release some of the wealth that we have locked in other parts of society to allow others to benefit from it. Now that is a huge tangent from education, but I think we've now got to the core fundamental principles of why things are unequal, why things are structured the way they are, and actually the role that education plays, like I said, really only impacts a very small part of that very broad social structure.
Yeah, I think I probably largely agree with that. And because you mentioned the historical element, I think there's always been that quite deep class divide within Britain. I think that is extremely true. And I'm not trying to take any political point taking here, but I do think the trouble is, if you go back to that Thatcher era, one of the problems which was done with, if you want, with the dismantling of the trade unions and the shutting down of the mines is that the alternatives to success were very much viewed in a certain light. So, the kind of successes were like, oh, but, all of these communities, now everyone can go off and they can go off to university and they can go and take some kind of marketing job. But that's not for everyone. And I would say one kind of element of classism which does exist is that form of classism, where you often see quite a lot of people who, in my opinion, are very well intended, but they will think, I'm really passionate about this. I want to get as many, of my kids into university, as many into the science sector. In a way, that is understandable, because that is where quite a lot of the money does lie. But at the same time, it shouldn't necessarily be that way. When I look at, what can we learn from other countries? That's one thing which I have noticed from studying countries a little bit like Holland and Germany. I feel like they've got a bit more of what I'd call an up-to-date and refreshing attitude. People at points do criticise the way that educational system is structured, but I think people also misunderstand it in something such as the vocational stream, and each of those receives quite a lot of respect. And then lots of people who then go into the vocational stream are able to access things such as political parties, and therefore that gives you a bit more of a balanced society. So a little bit of a tangent there, but to go into our fifth question, Dave, what do you think we can learn from other countries' educational systems? What are the kinds of countries who we should be looking at?
Yeah, really important question there. I think just to start with, to lay some context, it's a difficult one comparing education systems because, as I mentioned with schools operating on a local level, you need to be reactive to your local context. You can apply that globally as well. We're very different to the Singaporean context or the South Korean context, or in terms of the Scandinavian countries that are sort of seen as the world leaders in education, and perhaps it's more reflective of, I don't want to frame it this way, but the power that the government can have over the factors which affect the education system. So as we've identified, some of these things are so embedded culturally, they go way beyond anything that the government could realistically tackle in a very simple way. So sometimes what you end up doing is just tackling very superficial issues which don't really get to the root cause. I think governments could do more, but it's a very difficult job which would take decades to resolve. So firstly, just to lay that context, I think we are limited to a certain extent what we can do in this country. But I think one point you made, which I would agree with, is the vocational system. We perhaps rely too much on a very traditionally academic system over here, which isn't for everybody. Part of my research, I worked with quite a diverse range of young people and followed them from year 11 at school through to year 13. Some of them did go on to do A levels, but quite a few of them went on to do vocational qualifications. And this idea of a disparity of esteem, the fact that vocational qualifications aren't as highly regarded in this country, is just another way that sort of social divide appears, where you tend to get young people from lower socioeconomic groups, for example, going into vocational education. So it's seen as a second-class option. There is obviously the T-level system, which is being introduced, which we shall see how that plays out. But again, fundamentally, if the vocational system is seen as second-rate, then what can you really do to adjust that? If universities are still prioritising A levels, if employers are still prioritising A level grades over vocational qualifications.
And I think that's a really good point, and something that's come throughout talking to you is that things are so interlinked, and that society will benefit from education, obviously, and it's cyclical, and it's the same kind of points that come up again and again, whatever angle you look at it from. So that's been really fascinating chatting to you, David. And I don't know, Chris, have you got any final questions at all for him?
I could go on for hours, mate, but we best wrap it up there. It's been a healthy hour or so, I'd say.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, thanks so much for coming on. We'll definitely have you on again to talk about some other aspects. So thanks again. Well, we were really lucky to chat to David about one of the big questions in modern society. How can we create an education system which is fair, inclusive, and genuinely helpful for young people and their future careers? It's clear that things are not straightforward, and we still have a long way to go. But it's so important that researchers and educators like David are always looking at improvements and looking at how education fits into society as a whole. We'll be back talking to another of Reading's experts about current affairs and issues that affect all of our lives. But until then, take care and goodbye.